Catelyn Stark stood on the battlements of Riverrun, the wind tugging at her hair with insistent fingers. The cool evening sky, a dull purple marbled with streaks of soft orange, cast a hazy glow across the waters of the Red Fork. She tried to let the hush of the coming night soothe her. It had been a day of negotiations, an unexpected one, that might redefine the course of the war for the North, for the Riverlands, and even for the untamed peoples beyond the Wall. Word had arrived in the early hours. An envoy, sent from none other than Mance Rayder, the self-styled king beyond the Wall. He had crossed the lands north of the Neck under concealed banners, through forest paths rarely trodden by Southerners. He had braved the tumultuous heart of the Riverlands with a small band of followers, wildlings, men and women haggard and fierce, a presence no one could have expected in the aftermath of so many battles raging across the Seven Kingdoms. Rumors abounded. They had slipped past Bolton's men, avoided Frey scouts, and circumvented the lions of House Lannister who prowled these lands. It seemed impossible. Mance had come south seeking an alliance, not with the Iron Throne, not with any of the other great lords, but specifically with Catelyn Stark, Lady of Winterfell, mother of Robb Stark, and an unexpected but steadfast leader in her own right. That a man from beyond the Wall should seek her out in the Riverlands of all places was baffling at first. But the more she had listened to him speak, the more she understood that Mance Rayder's aim was not conquest alone. Survival drove him. A war more significant than anything in the south was brewing in the far north, beyond the frost-crusted edges of the realms. Mance had told her, in calm, clipped tones, about the White Walkers, about an icebound threat. She had heard some of it from her son, Robb, and from ravens that had reached them. Gravely urgent messages from the Night's Watch. In so many ways, her heart clung to the hope that these might only be tales. But if the rumored threat was real, she had to listen. When Mance finished his entreaties earlier that day, his wildling escort had retreated into the shadows. Catelyn had pressed him for details, her mind awhirl with the enormity of what he was suggesting. A union of the free folk with the river lords. It sounded unthinkable at first. These were men and women who had clashed against the Night's Watch for centuries, who were known as raiders and thieves in the stories old and once told in Winterfell. But Mance was neither savage nor uneducated. He had once been a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. He knew the realm's politics, had lived among the Southrons, and recognized the significance of forging new ties. Allies. The notion hung in the cool twilight air. Mance had asked not for blind subservience, but for an understanding. For the free folk to survive, they needed safe lands, farmland, a place to raise their children away from the encroaching cold. And in return, he would offer them as swords, as archers, as watchers on the front lines. There were tens of thousands of them, from all different clans, all living free beyond the Wall under Mance's banner. If he could manage to gather them in one place for a single cause, that cause might be swayed toward helping the Starks and Tullis hold the Riverlands as well. A stirring proposition. Catelyn stayed on the battlements long after Mance was escorted to quarters within Riverrun, close enough to keep an eye on him, distant enough that he should understand the trust offered was still guarded. She let her gaze slide over the river, remembering her father's lessons about the tides, about the currents and how rivers could unite or divide. Water gave life, shaped the land. Perhaps, she mused, an alliance with Mance Rayder was like water surging in an unexpected course. She wondered if that course might, in time, carve out a new future for them all. When she finally descended, the hallways of Riverrun were silent. Torches glowed along the walls. The hush felt heavy, as though the very stones were holding their breath, waiting for what might unfold. She directed the guards to stand watch at Mance's door, to bring the Wildling King any comfort he required. They had done so, though the tension on their faces was clear. They did not like that a king beyond the Wall roamed their corridors at all. At dawn, Catelyn called her uncle, Brynden Blackfish Tully, and her brother Edmure into her solar. The meeting was terse. Edmure's eyes glinted with distrust at the notion of associating with wildlings. But Brynden, ever more pragmatic, considered the notion carefully. The war that raged against House Lannister and House Frey was fierce. Now that Rob's host was fractured and the North had lost so much in the betrayal at the Twins, every advantage was precious. A vast army from beyond the wall might be a desperate gamble, but it was the first real chance at replenishing their forces, especially if these warriors were as numerous as rumored. Still, it was not only about arms and men. What would the other lords of the Riverlands say? Could they stomach a tribe of wildlings living on their lands, albeit under the Stark banner? Hostility toward wildlings had always run deep. Tales of raids and abductions made them monsters in the eyes of many small folk. To quell that distrust might require every ounce of Catelyn's diplomacy. Yet a new voice in her mind whispered that if there was one chance to stop the tides of death she had seen sweeping through the realm, if there was one chance to protect what remained of her children, this might be it. She gave orders to gather the remaining river lords that were loyal, Lord Jason Mallister, who was harried by Ironborn to the west, and certain other banners who might at least hear her out. The Blackfish nodded solemnly and set about sending ravens. Later that day, she received Mance Rayder in her father's old solar once more. The morning sun shone through arrow-slit windows, illuminating motes of dust swirling around them. Mance looked more at ease than one would expect for a man so far out of his element. He was dressed in simple dark leathers, the garb of a ranger. Despite the streaks of silver in his hair, there was a vitality in him, an unbreakable sureness. "I have no illusions about how your people see mine," Mance said the moment the door closed behind them, his voice low but steady. "Monsters. But I'll tell you this. We are men and women. Many have families, children. In the face of the long night, there should be no difference between us." Catelyn studied him. He was no lord, no knight. Yet the way he carried himself, the iron in his words, compelled respect. The quiet hush of the solar wrapped around them as she considered her response carefully. "We are in an impossible war, Mance Rayder," she said, folding her hands on the table between them. "The Riverlands bleeds under Lannister occupation. My own homeland, the North, has been ravaged by the Ironborn and by House Bolton's treachery. The men who remain loyal to my son, King Robb," her voice caught slightly on the word, "they are spread across these lands, battered from one battle to another. Now you come telling me of the White Walkers, something more terrifying than the horrors we already face, and you ask me to form an alliance. I cannot do so lightly." Mance nodded. "I don't come lightly. My people are scattered along the wall, and many are gathering south of it. We need somewhere to go, but there's more than that. My people, most will follow me if we can find them safety. We will fight. We will fight your battles, if that is what's needed, to prove our worth. But I will not subject them to feudal oaths. We've lived free all our lives." Catelyn lifted her chin. "The river lords will balk. They will want you to bend the knee, to kneel to their king." Mance's smile was wry. "I've told one king already. I won't bow. The free folk do not kneel." She felt a stir of something between admiration and exasperation. "And yet you call yourself their king beyond the wall," she said softly. "Is that not a contradiction?" Mance gave a short laugh, eyes glinting. "Some would say so, but it's a title I never sought. They gave it to me because I united them, because I brought them hope. They follow me because they choose to, not out of fealty. If we must do this alliance, it must be an alliance of equals." Catelyn leaned forward. "Then let us talk about your plans, Mance Rayder, and see if we can find a path that satisfies us both." They spoke for hours. He described in detail the various clans under his rule. The Vens, the Hornfoots, the Ice River clans, the Raiders and Huntsmen, the Spearwives, the leaders who owed him loose loyalty. Each had its own culture, its own grudges. He explained how he had managed to negotiate fragile truces among them by emphasizing the common threat in the far north. But moving so many people across the wall had drawn the ire of the Night's Watch. Jon Snow, Ned Stark's bastard, was among the Black brothers who tried to parley with him, though Mance offered few details on that. He spoke of monstrous wights, of the dead walking, and the way the ice itself could come alive with malice. Catelyn listened, her skin crawling. It seemed unthinkable that these things might roam the night, stirring just as the Seven Kingdoms tore at each other. At the end of it, Catelyn stood and moved to the window, gazing out onto the courtyard below. Men wearing the Tully trout on their surcoats led horses, carried arms. A child darted between them, laughing in the early sun. This was what she fought for, she reminded herself. A realm in which her children could be safe, in which the small folk would not be destroyed by one tyrant or another. The war with the Lannisters was on the cusp of tilting in any direction. The phrase, "all men must die," had crossed her mind more times than she could count since Ned's execution. But if Mance truly had tens of thousands behind him, that might be a turning point. She saw in his face the seriousness of his cause. An alliance with him was not only practical, it might be the only real means to fortify against a horror the Southern Lords refused to acknowledge. "Very well, Mance," she said at last. "I will send word to King Robb of what we plan. I will gather my banners, those who remain. You will have an audience with those who doubt you. We will see if we can find terms that bring your people south, that aid the Riverlands, and that keep your freedom intact. Understand that I can't promise immediate acceptance. You will have to prove yourself. But if you're as determined as you appear, perhaps we can walk this path together." He nodded, relief flickering across his features. "I thank you, Lady Stark. My people thank you as well, though most of them don't even know yet what you might do for them." She offered a faint smile. "Let us hope this leads to fewer knives in the dark. My realm has seen enough betrayals." Later that afternoon, the Blackfish returned from his errands with news. Some river lords had responded, some had not. The next step would be a meeting at Riverrun, a gathering of those who still honored House Tully, or who at least were not too frightened to show their faces. Brynden Tully eyed Mance Rayder with open caution, sizing him up in the main hall. Mance stared back, unwavering. Neither seemed eager to break the silence, until Mance, with a nod, acknowledged the famed warrior that was Catelyn's uncle. The Blackfish, for his part, moved on with courteous efficiency, ensuring that Mance and his small band of wildlings had accommodations. The days that followed were a strange swirl of tension and excitement. Ravens flitted in and out of Riverrun's rookery with unusual frequency. Guards patrolled the ramparts in double shifts. Catelyn prepared letters for Robb, though the uncertain nature of communications, his army always on the move, made it likely the news would lag behind events. The phrase still controlled the twins, so even the simplest of messages had to be carried covertly through roundabout paths. Still, she wrote. She tried to capture in words the importance of what Mance had said about the threat from the far north, the necessity of forging new alliances. And though she knew her son was a king, she prayed he would heed her as a mother in this matter. They needed every hand, even if that hand came from a place so alien to the south. One evening, after her letters were prepared and sent, she found Mance in the courtyard, idly whittling a small figure from a block of wood. Firelight flickered from the torches set against the walls. The wildling turned the carving in his hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. The figure looked a bit like a crouching bear, though the shape was not fully formed. He looked up and nodded as she approached. "You carve?" Catelyn asked quietly, willing to seize any moment to better understand this man. He shrugged. "I've had long stretches of time beyond the wall, waiting out storms. It soothes the mind." He paused, then held the figure up. "This was meant to be a direwolf, though I fear I may not do it justice." Her lips curved faintly as she studied the rough shape. "You do better than I might." They fell silent for a moment, the hush only broken by the distant rush of the river. He set the wood aside and turned to her. "Your uncle, the Blackfish, he's wary. He trusts me, but he trusts war's harsh realities even more. He's been in battle since before I was born. War changes people. It hardens them, makes them suspicious of everything." Mance nodded. "And I am an unknown. Your southern wars are complex. Alliances shift with gold, with marriage, with power. We free folk have our own complexities, but we don't scheme quite the way southern lords do. We feud, we fight, but we don't weave such tangled webs. I fear I'll never master that." A small sigh escaped her. "Some days I wish I didn't have to, but such is our way. Particularly now, when everyone sees an opportunity to seize or a threat to destroy. He searched her face. I want you to know, Lady Stark, that if I could simply march my people around these troubles, I would. But the dead don't care about our borders. Winter is coming, you say, here in the south. But I've seen what winter truly can be, and it is far darker than a bit of snow and cold nights. She found herself shivering, remembering old stories of the long night. Yes, she murmured. I believe you, perhaps more than you know. Soon enough, the day for the assembly arrived. A handful of river lords trickled into Riverrun. Some arrived with small retinues, others came alone. Each, in their own way, expressed trepidation at the notion of meeting with a wildling king on Tully ground. Yet they trusted Catelyn enough to at least hear Mance out. Lord Jason Mallister was first to greet her, a middle-aged man whose hair was salted with gray from the stress of holding Seaguard against the Ironborn. Beside him was his son, Patrek, tall and well-built, who eyed the wildlings from across the yard with unconcealed curiosity. There was also Lord Carol Vance and Lady Lucia Smallwood, who had taken over for her late husband after he was killed on the Green Fork. Each passing arrival was a swirl of banners and hushed conversation, the tension palpable whenever they spotted the half-dozen wildlings posted by Mance near the stable yard, all gathered in the great hall under the Tully banners. Catelyn stood at the head of the long table. Mance stood beside her, wearing plain garb, but still exuding that odd, quiet confidence. The lords took their seats, each surrounded by guards or counselors. Low murmurs fell silent as Catelyn lifted a hand. Outside, the bright midday sun caught on the windows, illuminating the hall in bands of golden light. You know who I am, she began, and I believe by now you have each heard rumors of the man beside me. This is Mance Rayder, known as King Beyond the Wall. An immediate ripple of mutters spread along the table, but she pressed on, her voice steady. He has come seeking an accord that, if we are wise, could benefit both his people and ours. He speaks of a threat rising in the far north, one that makes all these southern squabbles pale in comparison. I am inclined to believe him because I have heard enough from my son, King Robb, and from the Night's Watch to suspect it is true. Lord Mallister cut in. With respect, Lady Stark, I fail to see how this man or his savage followers could help us. We are fighting a war against the Lannisters in our own lands. The Iron Throne wants us crushed. The Freys bar our northern passage. What can a handful of wild raiders do to change that? Mance stepped forward, and for a moment, his presence commanded their attention. If it is a handful of raiders you think I have, you are mistaken, he said. I have tens of thousands of men, women, and children. More than your lords combined, perhaps. We are scattered now, but I can bring them together. In the time since the Watch has tried to stop us, we have moved south in small, quiet bands. More weight along the Gift, near the Frostfangs. Among us, you'll find skilled archers, fierce spears, mammoth riders, giants. We bring our own strengths to the table. Yet my people must have a place to live. We cannot wander forever. Lady Smallwood's brow furrowed. Are you saying you expect us to open our homes, our towns, to so many foreigners? Mance's gaze hardened. I expect no home to be open to pillaging, but my people want to settle. If that means farmland that has been burned or left fallow by the war, then we'll restore it. We'll grow crops, trade goods. We won't kneel. We won't be your serfs. But we will help defend these lands if the cost is that we may remain. Again, a murmur of discontent, but a few lords wore expressions of calculation. The prospect of fresh recruits was tempting indeed, especially with Tywin Lannister's forces looming. House Vance, ravaged by the war, had lost a significant portion of their fighting men and might see advantage in new bodies ready to fight. Lord Mallister crossed his arms, struggling visibly to weigh the risks. Catelyn let the discussion spiral for a time, only interjecting to keep the peace when voices rose too high. Then Brynden Tully spoke. The realm is on the brink. We cannot pretend that the Lannisters won't come for us again, soon. Even if we find a tenuous peace, they'll eventually come. We lost many men. If Mance Rayder speaks true, If he indeed can bring thousands more to our cause, that's a force we'd be fools to dismiss." He paused, turning sharp eyes on Mance. "But how can you prove your loyalty? You claim you won't kneel. Yet how do we know you won't turn on us the moment it suits you?" Mance met his stare with quiet intensity. "What do I gain by turning on you? The Lannisters would kill us as soon as look at us. The Boltons, the Freys, all of them see my people as enemies. If we betray House Stark or House Tully, we have nowhere to go. For us, this is all or nothing. Our alliance is our survival. If we fail, if we flee, the real war in the north will follow. The dead don't differentiate between a kneeler or a free man." An uneasy hush settled. Mance had invoked a terror few truly believed in, yet the disquiet it stirred was plain. Outside, a crow cawed, as though mocking the mortals who argued within. The day was long, the negotiations tense. By dusk, no final agreement had been reached, but no one stormed out, either. They agreed to discuss further, to see if some middle ground could be hammered into shape. Over the following week, the slow, painful forging of an alliance began. News trickled in that Lannister FO. Rsees were burning farms east of Riverrun, harassing outriders, pushing at the edges of Tully-held lands. In hushed corners, some lords whispered that a bold strike might be possible if they could incorporate wildling forces quickly. Others remained full of doubt. Every meeting tested Catelyn's patience and Mance's composure. Occasionally, tensions erupted when a wildling chieftain or spearwife, newly arrived, spat furious words at lords who spoke condescendingly. Threats would flare, swords half-drawn, only for Mance or Brynden Tully to step in, a steadying hand or a sharp command. And in time, to everyone's surprise, the shape of a deal began to coalesce. A wide swath of land along the war-ravaged tracts of the Riverlands, theoretically under Stark rule, but in which the free folk could live freely. They would not bow. They would not owe feudal service. Instead, they would form a mutual defense pact. If House Stark or House Tully was threatened, the free folk would fight to protect this new homeland. If outsiders attacked the free folk, Catelyn would call upon the River Lords to defend them as well. It was more radical than anything most of the lords had ever conceived. Yet the war's horrors had chipped away at tradition, and the promise of so many potential warriors was too great to dismiss. Though no formal documents could be signed until Robb Stark returned or confirmed it, the lords present formed a preliminary acceptance. Mance's eyes shone with a kind of fierce triumph when the last handshake was exchanged in the Great Hall. He was a man who had broken centuries of animosity. But as the days wore on, a strange kinship began to arise. Malister's son, Patrek, offered to spar with a wildling scout named Hareth, and the two parted with bruises and grins. The Blackfish himself tested one of Mance's top spearwives in a friendly bout, which ended in a narrow victory for Brynden Tully, though he later admitted she had been as swift as a water dancer. If Catelyn dared to dream of unity, she found her hopes mingled with deep apprehension. Such an alliance was fragile. Any spark could set it aflame. Most of the River Lords had not yet encountered the free folk's larger clans. The differences in custom, in practice, in worldview could prove irreconcilable. And all the while, the Lannisters, the Freys, and the Boltons would not remain idle. On a more personal level, she feared how Robb would react. He had grown into a king who understood some measure of diplomacy, but dealing with wildlings was never part of his lessons in Winterfell. Still, necessity was the mother of many changes. Soon came the first test of the fragile accord. Word arrived at Riverrun of a small retinue of Lannister men sacking a village near the Trident. The Blackfish and Mance decided to dispatch a combined scouting force to confirm the rumors and see if a counterattack might be feasible. The Blackfish took 50 Tully men. Mance sent Tormund Giantsbane, his trusted friend, with a band of 40 wildlings. Catelyn watched them ride out side by side, an improbable sight. The proud trout banner flapping next to free folk wearing patchwork leathers and carrying rough-hewn spears. The small folk gaped and whispered as these forces passed, unsure what to make of it. But their combined presence made an impression. If the war-weary peasants feared the wildlings, some recognized, too, that these were new allies, an infusion of strength in a time of dire need. Catelyn herself remained at Riverrun to manage the daily complexities. Lords came to her with concerns about supplies for the newcomers. She attempted to reassure them, explaining that the Wildlings would eventually grow their own food on the farmland left unworked since the last wave of raids. But for now, the castle stores had to see them through. The Blackfish had placed a strict rationing plan, mindful of the possibility of a siege. Mance, for his part, instructed a few of his hunters to roam the woods to bring back game, ensuring his people were not a burden entirely. Tensions flared occasionally, especially when small folk encountered the savage aesthetic of the free folk, but no major violence broke out. Several days later, Tormund and the Blackfish's party returned. They bore news of a roving Lannister force near the Trident, roughly 300 strong. They also carried grim tidings. 2 villages had been thoroughly pillaged, with charred ruins and butchered corpses left behind. The Blackfish's voice shook with anger as he relayed the details to Catelyn and Mance in a private war council. Tormund spat out curses, slamming a rough fist onto the table. Mance's expression turned somber, as though seeing anew the ugliness of southern war. They decided, after some debate on an ambush. The Blackfish favored a straightforward, disciplined approach. Lure the Lannisters onto unfavorable terrain near a marshy bend in the Trident, then strike with archers, cavalry, and foot soldiers. Mance and Tormund, however, knew how to harass enemies in the wild. They suggested sending small, mobile groups ahead of the main force to cause confusion, leading the Lannisters astray into the muck. The Blackfish, not without some reluctance, agreed to incorporate elements of their tactics. So, for the first time in history, men from the Riverlands and the Free Folk planned a joint attack. They marched at dawn. Catelyn watched from the gates as they departed, trying not to let the memories of Robb's armies weigh her heart. Soldiers in Tully colors mingled with fur-clad wildlings. Lords who had once fought under her father's banners rode alongside men who had grown up in the icy wilderness beyond the wall. It was a sight both inspiring and unnerving. She spent the next 2 days in anxious waiting. She told herself they would succeed, that the combined knowledge of the Blackfish and Mance's reavers would outwit the Lannisters. She prayed to the old gods and the new for a swift, decisive victory. On the 3rd day, the ravens came, a victory indeed, if not a perfect one. The Blackfish's plan, enhanced by Mance's cunning, had worked. They ambushed the Lannisters near the marshy bend. The Wildling scouts led the enemy's outriders astray, forcing them into boggy terrain. Then Tully archers rained arrows upon them. The Lannister force, disoriented, tried to withdraw, only to face a frontal charge by Tormund's party. Still, the victory had come at a cost. More than a dozen Tully men were dead, and nearly 30 Wildlings had fallen as well. The Lannisters suffered heavy casualties, but some survivors fled west, possibly to regroup. The news spread like wildfire throughout the Riverlands, igniting hope. Perhaps, some whispered, this improbable alliance might even the scales. Word reached the small folk that the Wildlings fought fiercely, men and women side by side, unstoppable in their fury, and that the Tully Knights offered disciplined support, ensuring the enemy could not break through. The Blackfish wrote to Catelyn, praising Tormund Giantsbane's courage, even if the man's jokes and ribald comments made a few knights blush. He is every bit as wild as we expected, Brynden wrote, but beneath the roar of laughter, I suspect he is a good man. I never thought I'd say that about any man from beyond the wall. Their success won the alliance a measure of legitimacy. More lords, once wavering, sent cautious envoys to Riverrun. Some simply wanted to see if the rumors were true. Others brought small gifts, grain, furs, a token of goodwill. Mance accepted them graciously but reminded Catelyn that he must soon lead more of his people south. They can't remain scattered in the north. Sooner or later, the Night's Watch or the Boltons will pick them off. Catelyn nodded. Let us finalize the terms here. Then, if we can, we'll guide them south in small groups. The last thing we need is for the Freys at the Twins to notice tens of thousands crossing the Green Fork. Mance sighed, running a hand through his wind-blown hair. I'll need your help to hide our movements. We can't risk open conflict with the Freys while we're so disorganized. They hold a key crossing, do they not? Her lips thinned. Yes, and their lord, Walder Frey, is no friend of mine. My son was betrayed at the Red Wedding. If we can avoid the twins, we will. But there are lesser-known fords, especially if you don't mind braving deeper waters. That we can do, Mance said. We're used to worse. Catelyn listened as he laid out an idea to funnel the Wildlings through remote parts of the Trident, far from the twins. She worried about the risk. A single rumor in the wrong ear, and the Freys might move to intercept them. But with the Lannisters otherwise occupied, perhaps they could slip past. In truth, there was little choice. Without bringing his people south, Mance's alliance would remain only on parchment. And his people were bound to face even darker threats if they stayed near the wall. They had to move quickly. The first groups of free folk began their journey soon after. Batches of a few hundred each, escorted by small teams of Tully men in plain garb or wildlings who already knew the route. Catelyn oversaw the logistics. Edmure helped grudgingly, though he still harbored reservations. Over the course of weeks, these bands trickled into the Riverlands, quietly settling near deserted villages or burned-out farmland. A few places had enough surviving inhabitants to view these new arrivals with alarm, and small incidents broke out. But for the most part, the presence of Tully men or even Mance himself managed to calm tensions. As the settlement process continued, Catelyn and Mance discovered how difficult it was for two vastly different peoples to merge. The Riverlords insisted on certain rules, such as forbidding the Wildlings from simply taking goods without a recognized exchange. Many Wildlings chafed at the notion of ownership. More than one fight erupted when a local farmer or craftsman confronted a free folk family for gathering from an orchard. The Blackfish ordered immediate mediation, imposing fines or restitution to keep the peace. Mance, meanwhile, admonished his people to respect certain boundaries, explaining that the heart of their new arrangement demanded they not antagonize the local lords needlessly. Tensions flared anew when certain spearwives insisted they would roam where they liked. Catelyn privately admired their boldness, but recognized the risk such independence posed. Every day felt like walking a tightrope. Still, amidst the strife, cooperation sometimes blossomed. Some wildlings who were skilled hunters taught local men and women more efficient ways to track game or to set traps. In exchange, the Riverlands folks showed them advanced farming methods and introduced them to southern grains they could cultivate. Children, unconcerned with the baggage of tradition, played together, forging friendships in the muddy yards behind battered cottages. As harvest season began in earnest, more farmland that had lain scorched or trampled by Lannister boots was tilled again, with the combined labor of both sides. Catelyn rode out to see it for herself one crisp morning. Men with fish sigils on their tunics guiding sturdy plow horses, while wildlings walked alongside, using picks to break apart clumps of hard earth. A swirl of crows soared overhead, as if marveling at the spectacle. One day, a raven arrived with a reply from Robb Stark. Catelyn's heart pounded as she read his words. Her son's message was terse but cautiously supportive. He had heard rumors of her negotiations, and it seemed he trusted her judgment, though he warned that certain northern lords might object strenuously to free folk settling in the Riverlands. With House Bolton having turned traitor, with the Ironborn still holding Moat Cailin and sections of the north, Robb's resources remained stretched. If an alliance with Mance Rayder would bring relief, he would welcome it, so long as the Wildlings did not threaten loyal northerners. He ended by reminding his mother that she was to remain safe, and that he still intended to break the Lannister hold on the Riverlands. The letter's tone felt older, heavier, than she remembered. He was no longer a boy, but a king hardened by war. When she showed Mance the letter, he nodded, satisfied. He isn't foolish, your son. The best kings rarely are. It remained to be seen how the rest of the realm would react. For now, they kept the alliance discreet, focusing on the immediate tasks of fortifying the region and sustaining the newly arrived free folk. All the same, word spread that Mance Rayder was in Riverrun, forging a new order. Some travelers dismissed it as tall tales, but others believed, weaving rumors that the Wildlings had come to help Lady Stark avenge the Red Wedding. So it was that when a pair of Bolton scouts crossed into the northernmost edges of the Riverlands, they encountered a band of free folk who attacked them outright. The scouts managed to flee, but not before losing a few men to wildling arrows. Soon after, a message arrived from the Dreadfort, demanding to know why these so-called northern savages were in league with the Starks. Catelyn only read the message once before tossing it into the fire. Her lips were thin. The Boltons had committed worse atrocities than many Lannisters, and if they were rattled, so be it. As autumn drew on, the days shortened, the nights grew sharper. Catelyn felt a shift in the air. The Starks' words, "Winter is coming," resounded in her mind. Mance seemed to sense it too. He pressed for more of his people to be brought south, urging that once the snows set in, crossing the neck would grow hazardous. In an emergency meeting, she, Mance, the Blackfish, and Edmure mapped out a schedule for the final wave of wildlings to come. It would be the largest group by far thousands, waiting just north of the neck, near the ruins of Moat Cailin. If they could slip through the swamplands undetected by the Freys or the Boltons, they would converge near the Trident. It was a risky, monumental undertaking, but without it, the alliance was incomplete. Mance grew restless, insisting on riding north to guide them himself. "Let me go," Catelyn said quietly one evening, surprising them all. Mance turned sharply. "You, Lady Stark? Why would you place yourself in such danger?" She folded her hands in front of her. "Because I can parley with the Crannogmen. I can call upon the loyalty they once offered House Stark. Some remain hidden in the swamps. If any see a suspicious host crossing, they might act. But if I'm there, if they recognize a Stark, they might stand aside or even help us move unseen. We need that. Lord Howland Reed is a friend of my late husband's, though he keeps to his fastness in Greywater Watch." Brynden Tully interjected. "I cannot allow you to ride into such peril alone, Cat." "I won't be alone. Mance will be there. And if Lord Howland can be found, he'll offer safe passage. I must do this. I can't remain behind walls forever, delegating these tasks to others. We face a monumental decision. If I put my own life behind this alliance, it might just persuade the more stubborn among the wildlings and Crannogmen alike." The Blackfish's expression was pained, but he nodded eventually. "Very well. I'll keep Riverrun secure in your absence. Edmure will aid me. But please, Cat, for your children's sake, exercise caution." So it was that Lady Catelyn Stark prepared to depart for the Neck alongside Mance Rayder. They took a small escort of Tully men, plus a handful of wildlings skilled at navigating unfamiliar territory. Tormund Giantsbane, recently returned from his victory against the Lannisters, insisted on accompanying them. "Who else will keep you Southron lot entertained?" he bellowed with a grin. Mance agreed, partly for Tormund's prowess in battle, partly because his presence would encourage any hesitant free folk to believe in the mission. The morning they set out was damp and misty, the fortress walls beaded with dew. A group of riverlords stood to watch them go, some still uncertain about letting their liege lady ride off into such unknown danger. But Catelyn's eyes were steadfast. She mounted a sturdy courser, took up the reins. Mance Rayder rode at her side, clad in a mixture of boiled leather and scavenged mail. Tormund, red-bearded and full of booming laughter, brought up the rear with a few more wildlings. They passed under Riverrun's gates, a hush falling over the watchers, and vanished into the rising fog. Their journey took them through war-scarred lands where once lush fields were blackened. The sky remained overcast. Villages they passed were either deserted or cautiously inhabited by small folk who recognized the Tully sigil or the face of Catelyn Stark. Most gave wide berth to the wildlings. A day's ride out, they found an inn, half-burned, the owners trying to rebuild. Catelyn spoke gently with the innkeep, purchasing what provisions she could. When the innkeep noticed the wildlings, she visibly trembled, but said nothing, taking the coins and nodding in thanks. Tormund left an extra coin behind, an unexpected gesture of generosity. When Catelyn questioned him, he only shrugged. "They lost more than we did, that's all." On the second night, they made camp in the shell of an abandoned holdfast. The air was still, as though anticipating a storm. Mance scouted the perimeter, returning to the circle of flickering campfires to report no immediate threats. "But I sense eyes," he muttered. "This land is full of watchers." Catelyn nodded. "The crannogmen of the Neck are rumored to be always watching. Not to mention brigands or even Lannister outriders. The war has scattered all sorts across the land. They slept fitfully, rotating watches." Catelyn found herself dreaming of Ned's face, of the last time she had seen him alive, in King's Landing. She awoke with tears on her cheeks, wiping them away in the darkness. When dawn came, she steeled herself, focusing on the mission at hand. By the time they reached the outskirts of the Neck, the terrain had shifted. Marshes spread out in every direction, reeds rustling in a soft wind. The path grew narrower, with water on both sides. The horses slogged carefully. Mance took the lead, scanning for any sign of movement. Tormund was uncharacteristically quiet. Catelyn recalled the stories Ned had told her about this region, that the crannogmen were a secretive folk, skilled in ambush, masters of poison darts and camouflage. If they chose to reveal themselves, it would be on their own terms. Half a day later, the first sign came. An arrow struck the ground a mere few paces ahead of Mance's horse. Everyone halted. Swords and axes were drawn, the wildlings bristling for a fight. But Catelyn called out, lifting a hand. "We come in peace, under the banner of House Stark," she cried. "I am Catelyn Stark. We seek passage north to gather my allies. We mean no harm." Silence reigned. Then, with barely a rustle, 3 figures emerged from the marsh. Their skin was muddied, their gear fashioned from leather and reeds. The one who seemed to be the leader, a slight, dark-haired woman, lowered a bow. "Catelyn Stark, you say?" Catelyn nodded. She carefully dismounted, stepping through the mire. "Yes, you know my husband's house. Lord Howland Reed is our friend." The crannogwoman regarded her warily, eyes flicking to the wildlings. "Who are these, then? You bring savage men into our swamps." Before Catelyn could respond, Mance spoke in a respectful tone. "We are the free folk. We've come for our kin who wait near Moat Cailin. With Lady Stark's help, we aim to settle in the Riverlands. We do not seek trouble with you." The woman studied them for a long moment. Then she guessed. Toward for them to follow, turning lively. "If you speak true, you may pass. But no sudden moves. We are many here, though you see only a few." Her voice was calm, laced with authority. Catelyn glimpsed more shadows flitting in the reed beds, figures with spears or bows. Indeed, the crannogmen were not to be trifled with. They led the party through a maze of marsh paths, some so narrow the horses could barely squeeze through. At times, shallow skiffs ferried them across deeper pools. Catelyn noticed the quiet skill of these guides, how they navigated with perfect confidence, never hesitating. The marshes stretched out in all directions, an impenetrable labyrinth to outsiders. She felt a surge of gratitude that the crannogmen had not shot first and asked questions later. Eventually, they reached a cluster of dry islands amid the swamp. Simple huts stood among gnarled trees. A ring of watchful crannog warriors surrounded them. There, in the largest hut, they found a man with streaks of silver in his hair, dressed in scaled leather made from fish and lizard skins. One of the guides leaned to Catelyn, whispering, "Lord Reed." Catelyn approached Howland Reed with cautious relief, remembering him from fleeting occasions in Winterfell. He had never been a man to seek the limelight. His eyes sparkled with intelligence as he took her in, then glanced at Mance, Rayder, and Tormund, and the others. "Lady Stark," he said quietly, voice soft yet clear, "you do not come unannounced. Whispers have already reached my ears of this alliance with the Wildfolk. You must know, many in the north are uneasy at best about such news." She inclined her head. "I know, but there is more at stake than our old prejudices. The dead rise in the far north, Lord Reed. The free folk must cross the wall to survive. My son, King Robb, has given his cautious blessing, and I need your help ensuring this last group of free folk can pass the Neck safely." Howland Reed's gaze flicked to Mance. "And you, king beyond the wall, what do you want from me?" Mance met his eyes steadily. "Safe passage for my people. Families, warriors, all of them. We can avoid the main roads, but the neck is your domain. If you permit it, we will go swiftly, cause no harm, and move on to the Riverlands. If you refuse, we'll have to find another path, risking attacks from Bolton men and perhaps your own as well." After a long pause, Lord Reed nodded. "You speak honestly enough. My Lord Eddard always spoke well of the free folk in a strange way. He believed that you were people of the same realm, only separated by an ancient barrier." Catelyn swallowed the lump in her throat at the mention of Ned. Howland continued, "I'll help you. The neck has known too much strife of late. The Boltons have sniffed around, and the Freys fancy they can extend their influence here. If your presence unsettles them, I find that no bad thing. But hear me, no raiding, no burning, no theft. If any of your folk harm my people, or our swampland, I'll personally ensure they don't leave alive." Mance inclined his head. "Agreed. We want no trouble." So it was settled. Howland Reed instructed his best scouts to guide them further north, where Mance's last host awaited near the ruined Moat Catelyn. They spent the night in the Crannog village, an uneasy truce. Wildlings and Crannog men eyed each other warily, but conversation arose here and there. Tormund boomed laughter at a fish stew the Crannog women served, proclaiming it better than any of that fancy southern fare. Catelyn found herself sitting beside Lord Reed, reminiscing about Ned, recalling the time he had told her about the tourney at Harrenhal, where Howland had once played a small but fateful role. In the morning, guided by silent Crannog men, they proceeded. The bogs eventually gave way to drier ground. The sky rumbled with distant thunder as they approached the old ruin of Moat Catelyn. Once, a proud fortress guarded the main approach to the north. Now only 3 towers remained, 2 half-collapsed. Around them stretched a wasteland of collapsed walls, waterlogged ditches, and tangles of brush. There, scattered in the shadows of ancient stone, was Mance's last host. Thousands of free folk, some half-starved, many exhausted, waiting in uncertain clusters. When they spotted Mance returning, some rose with cheers or ragged calls. Others watched in stony silence, suspicious of the strangers in Tully or Crannog garb. Catelyn surveyed the scene, her heart heavy. So many children, so many old folk, clad in furs even now. The fear in their eyes was not fear of men, but fear of the unknown. Mance dismounted, striding among them, greeting clan chieftains, hugging older women who had worried about him. Tormund roared in delight, embracing old friends. Catelyn, mindful of her station, kept a respectful distance but offered occasional gentle smiles to those who met her eyes. This was the reality of war. Not merely the battles, but the displacement and suffering it caused. She recalled the small folk of the Riverlands, who had endured pillage after pillage. In the hollow eyes of some wildling children, she saw the same haunted look as the orphans who clung to the wreckage of the Trident villages. With Howland Reed's help, the crossing began. Not all at once, rather in smaller waves as had been done before. The Crannog men guided them through hidden paths, ensuring that no large crowd would draw the attention of Bolton or Fry patrols. Catelyn stayed to oversee the process alongside Mance. Occasionally, a rumor would surface. A band of Bolton men was approaching from the east, or Lannister outriders were spotted near a certain road. Each time, scouts verified. Each time, they changed course accordingly, weaving through the vast wetlands. It was slow, painstaking work, fraught with tension. Some among the free folk grumbled at the snail's pace, wishing to push forward. But Mance, with a stern tone, kept them in line. "We stand or fall together," he reminded them. Took weeks. The nights grew colder and the days shorter. But at last, the bulk of the wildling host crossed the neck, trickling into the upper reaches of the Riverlands. From there, Tully guides led them to the designated areas, where farmland lay idle. Makeshift shelters went up. In some places, half-ruined towns began a slow rebirth, with free folk and Riverlanders working side by side to repair roofs, to stock provisions. Catelyn found herself leading smaller councils across the region, mediating disputes, ensuring that an unexpected influx of thousands did not starve or cause chaos. The Blackfish dispatched patrols to keep any roving enemies at bay. Mance, Tormund, and other wildling leaders divided their people among the various sites, ensuring no single location grew overwhelmed. Though challenges persisted, a fragile bond was forming. Men who had once scorned wildlings as savage began to see them as neighbors, if not quite friends. Certain wildlings discovered a sense of relief in the Riverlands' gentler climate, though others missed the harsh wilderness of the far north. Small steps, each day, but cumulatively, they laid the foundation for something new, an alliance that defied centuries of hatred and fear. But the shadow of war still loomed. Tywin Lannister was rumored to be gathering forces at Harrenhal. Roose Bolton might be mustering men in the north. The Freys seethed in their castle, no doubt hearing rumors that Catelyn Stark had ushered an army of wildlings into the Riverlands. They might be planning a strike, or waiting for an opportune moment to demand fealty from all these new settlers. Night after night, Catelyn wrestled with worry, uncertain if she had merely prolonged the inevitable clash. Yet each dawn, she rose to see a new glimmer of hope in the faces of those she led. However precarious, this alliance had already accomplished more than she once dared dream. One crisp evening in late autumn, Mance Rayder joined her atop a small rise overlooking a patch of farmland where wildlings labored to build sturdy huts before winter set in. Fires flickered below. The sunset dyed the clouds a brilliant red, as if heralding more bloodshed to come. But in that moment, the scene was oddly peaceful. Mance stood beside Catelyn in silence for a time, both gazing at the farmland, lost in separate thoughts. Eventually, he spoke in a quiet voice. "I never pictured it quite like this. If you had told me a year ago that I would stand in the south, forging alliances with a highborn lady, I would have laughed." She gave a soft, rueful chuckle. "If you had told me a year ago that I would join forces with men beyond the wall, I might have locked you in a cell. Yet here we are." A breeze pulled at her hair. Mance inhaled, as though tasting the changing air. "The long night is coming, Lady Stark. Even with all we've done, I fear it may not be enough." She nodded slowly. "I know. We still have so many enemies within the realm, and the threat from beyond the wall that cannot be held back forever. I only hope that when the time comes, we stand united, not divided." He turned, meeting her gaze. "You have given my people a chance. I want you to know, whatever happens, I will not forget that." The sincerity in his eyes startled her. She wondered how differently their worlds might have played out if men like him and Ned had met under kinder circumstances. "Let us pray that chance is worth the cost. We have a long road ahead." They watched as the final glimmer of light sank below the horizon. The sky turned velvet, flecked with stars. In the field below, wildling songs rose, haunting, rough harmonies that spoke of ice and wind and a relentless survival. It mingled with the simpler tunes of Riverlands folk, who, uncertain at first, had begun to offer a few of their own songs in exchange. Two cultures, bridging an ancient divide in the fading light. Winter was coming, yes, and with it unimaginable trials. But for this brief moment, under the dusky sky, there was a seed of hope, a possibility that the living could stand together against the cold and the dark. Catelyn let herself believe in that hope, if only for a single night, drawing comfort from the knowledge that in forging this alliance, she had done what Ned would have done. Acted for the greater good, despite all the risks. The future was unwritten, but they had taken the first bold step, forging bonds that might just save them all when the true storm arrived. Over the following weeks, more news arrived. House Lannister was indeed mustering at Harrenhal. Lord Tywin's mastery of war was unmatched, and if he marched west, the Riverlands would soon be under threat again. Yet for the moment he seemed to be watching, waiting. The Freys, too, were silent, though Catelyn sensed Walder Frey plotting in his webs. She braced for conflict but took each day as it came, focusing on strengthening the new partnership. Mance rallied his people to prepare defenses, to organize hunts, to trade with nearby settlements. Tormund formed scouting parties that patrolled the region's roads, turning back or capturing the occasional Lannister or Bolton spy. Some lords, once skeptical, began to grudgingly accept the presence of these new allies. The Blackfish, in a rare moment of calm humor, remarked to Catelyn, "I never thought I would see the day when I'd say this, but I find myself almost grateful for their ferocity." He admitted that the Wildlings, free of the typical knightly codes, took their duties quite seriously, patrolling in the dead of night, venturing into uncertain corners to flush out threats. They had little fear of scuffles, and their spirit seemed unbreakable. They were used to adversity on a scale that most Southrons couldn't fathom. Slowly, the Riverlands began to mend. Burned-out farmland was tilled once more. Roads, once bandit-ridden, found some measure of security thanks to joint patrols. The small folk, while wary, realized these new settlers might be the best hope for keeping Lannister marauders at bay. There were still incidents, clashes over property, misunderstandings of local customs. Yet Catelyn's presence, along with Mance's strict leadership of his own, helped to smooth rough edges. And so the seeds of cooperation blossomed, day by day, even as the realm teetered on the brink of another wave of war. One cold morning, a raven arrived bearing the seal of Robb Stark. He was on the march again, forging a path back toward the Riverlands, determined to reclaim lost ground. Catelyn read the message thrice, her pulse quickening with both pride and fear. Robb was bringing what remained of his northern bannermen, the outriders from House Mormont, the archers from House Glover, and rumored additions from certain mountain clans that had rallied to him after the treachery at the Twins. He would soon enter the Riverlands from the north, presumably crossing near Oldstones or maybe near the Blue Fork, depending on the enemy's positioning. The letter ended with a simple line, "Mother, if you have truly found allies in these free folk, prepare them. We shall need all the help we can get to break the Lannisters and the Freys once and for all." Catelyn's heart pounded. She looked at Mance, who stood in the courtyard speaking with Tormund. A swirl of wind rustled the battered Stark banners overhead. A moment later, she walked to them and handed Mance the letter. He read it with a serious expression. "So your son returns," he said softly. "Yes, and he will want us to stand with him. Now we must prove that our alliance was worth forging. The Lannisters will muster their army. The Freys may close in from the Twins, hoping to trap us between them. But if we are united, Tully men, Wildlings, and the Northmen under my son, we might just have enough strength to push them back, to rid this land of their occupation. Perhaps even strike a blow that ends the war." Tormund bared his teeth in a grin. "I'd like nothing more than to take a swing at these fancy lordlings who caused so much harm. Just point me at them, my lady." Mance exhaled slowly, scanning the bustling yard where free folk and Tully men mingled, sharpened weapons, prepared for the next threat. "Then let us ready our people. The battle comes, we will stand with your son. The men from the Thens, the spearwives from the frozen shore, everyone. We'll show the rest of the realm what it means to fight together." Catelyn nodded. She felt the wariness in her bones, the relentless toll of battles fought, loved ones lost. But also she felt a faint stirring of optimism. The watchers on the ramparts whispered of winter's approach, of far darker powers lurking in the north. Yet for now, they had a chance to defend what remained, to unify the living against all who would destroy them. In forging this bond between the free folk and the Riverlands, she had lit a small flame in the darkness. Perhaps, if they nurtured it, that flame could grow to challenge the coming cold. Evening shadows fell across Riverrun, the wind biting. Fires glowed in the hearth. Once again, Catelyn stood upon the walls, gazing over the wide sweep of farmland where Wildlings and Riverlanders shared tasks. She thought of the future, uncertain and fraught with danger. She thought of the White Walkers somewhere beyond the scope of normal men's imagination, of the Lannisters lurking behind the horizon with their polished armor and siege weapons, of the Freys perched at the Twins like vultures. But she also thought of Mance, Tormund, the Blackfish, and even the wily Crannogmen of the Neck. This alliance was not just about arms and swords. It was about a shift in the very order of the land. Night fell completely, starless, a vast black dome overhead. A wolf howled in the distance, perhaps a stray from the north or one of the few that had ventured this far south. Catelyn closed her eyes, imagining that the howl was a herald of Robb's arrival, of the Starks uniting with the free folk to shape a new day. She breathed deeply, letting the cold fill her lungs. The war was not over, nor would it be soon. But if Mance Rayder and Catelyn Stark could stand side by side, bridging ages of hatred between the Wildlings and the Riverlands, then perhaps the realm's endless cycle of bloodshed might finally crack, if only a little. Perhaps it was a fool's hope. Yet on this night, with the memory of her husband's honor and the courage of her son guiding her, she chose to believe in it. And so their story continued, forging a road that no one in the Seven Kingdoms had ever walked. Step by step, they pressed forward into an uncertain future. The living, bound by a new determination, would face the swords of the South and the terrors of the North together. And in that unity, fragile but defiant, lay the first true glimmer of a dawn that might follow the darkest of nights. The days that followed were spent in a controlled frenzy of preparation. Steel clanged against steel in Riverrun's courtyard as the Blackfish ordered weapons sharpened. Men drilled. Across the Riverlands, the free folk set to gathering supplies, mending gear, and finalizing the fortifications they had so hastily begun. Though the Alliance had found a measure of cohesion, everyone sensed that the true test lay just beyond the horizon. Robb Stark's march was but one chord in the cacophony of the realm's shifting war. Tywin Lannister loomed at Harrenhal, Walder Frey brooded in the Twins, Roose Bolton skulked in the far north. Any of them might move at a moment's notice. As twilight deepened one evening, Catelyn stood in Riverrun's main hall, finalizing details with several lords of the Riverlands and representatives of the Free Folk. Maps lay across a table, illuminated by the flames of a large hearth. Brynden Tully, known to all as the Blackfish, ran a finger along the trident's winding course. "We've confirmation from our scouts," he said quietly. "Small Lannister detachments are posted south of Harrenhal, harrying the countryside. They've not marched in full force. It's as if Tywin waits. Perhaps he's hoping to lure Robb into a disadvantage." Catelyn's gaze swept across the assembled company. Next to her uncle stood Lord Jason Mallister, his face drawn in tight lines of worry. On the other side, Mance Rayder's stance was confident, arms crossed over a supple leather jerkin. Tormund Giantsbane was absent, having gone off with a cadre of wildlings to run scouting missions of his own in the southwestern reaches. Another wildling presence at the table was the spearwife Rika, whose plaited hair and fiercely intelligent eyes had earned her a place among Mance's advisors. "Tywin Lannister does not strike before he knows he can win," Catelyn said, recalling the man's reputation. "We must ensure that when he chooses to move, we're prepared. My son's arrival should tip the scales, so long as we can unite our forces quickly enough. The River Lords, the Free Folk, and Robb's own host." Mance leaned over the map, tapping a calloused finger near the crossroads where the King's Road met the River Road. "Your son will likely descend around here, or perhaps cut across from the Blue Fork to throw off Lannister scouts. When he's close, we'll muster the largest force we can. If Tywin sees a threat big enough, he'll be forced to respond rather than picking us off piecemeal." A subdued murmur ran through the lords present. Edmure Tully, newly returned from a short tour of the outlying lands, rubbed his temples. "And if Walder Frey decides to close the noose, the Twins sits like a dagger pointed at us. He might send men south to harry our supply lines or attack us from behind when we face the Lannisters." The mention of the phrase unsettled everyone. One betrayal was enough. None doubted the old weasel's capacity for more. Ance's eyes narrowed. "We'll maintain watchers and outriders along the Green Fork, as we have done. If the phrase muster, we'll see them coming, or so we hope." Catelyn inclined her head. "We must keep a stronger guard there. I'll not see Robb trapped like a fox in a snare. Let us position scouts at every crossing, every hidden ford." A silent agreement seemed to pass among them. They spent another hour hashing out details before disbanding. Catelyn lingered in the hall as the others departed in small clusters, speaking in low voices. She caught Mance Rayder's eye across the table. He waited until the last of the Riverlords had filed out before coming nearer. "Lady Stark," he said gently, You look troubled. She allowed a soft laugh, mirthless. I've been troubled for longer than I can remember, but I'll confess, seeing these plans set out so starkly reminds me how precarious our situation is. One great victory, and we might break the Lannisters' hold. One defeat, and, well, we might lose everything. Mance's voice dropped to a murmur. Your people, these river lords, have grown to trust me more than I'd have thought possible, yet I still sense wariness. A fresh betrayal would undo us all. She nodded. As do I. But you're not the only one they watch for betrayal. She closed her eyes briefly, thinking of the uneasy glances her own banner lords threw her way. They questioned whether forging ties with the free folk might spark fresh conflict with the North or the Iron Throne. We must hope we've taken enough measures to secure their loyalty. Mance considered her. We can only do what we can. The rest is in the hands of your 7 gods, or the old ones, if you prefer. Or perhaps just men and women, with hearts strong enough to do what must be done. She summoned a small smile. Try to rest, Mance. Tomorrow will bring fresh concerns. He gave a short nod, then turned away, his footsteps echoing in the near-empty hall. Catelyn was left alone with the hiss of the hearth fire and the fading echoes of the council's voices. The weight of command felt like a cold stone lodged against her chest. She thought of Robb, recalling his boyish grin when he was small, chasing Bran across the courtyard of Winterfell. Those days were gone, replaced by the duty of kingship that had aged him beyond his years. She prayed he would arrive swiftly and in strength. Frost dusted the morning fields. The next day dawned pale and quiet, an eerie calm that set Catelyn's nerves on edge. The Blackfish had already directed patrols to fan out across the region, and by mid-morning, one such patrol returned with news. A large bannerless company had been seen crossing the Red Fork to the north. They were not Lannisters, not Freys. The scouts described their garb as a motley of furs and patchwork armor, with a single banner of gray and white. "Wolves, my lady," said the patrol leader. "Looked like wolves on that banner. They move with discipline, though they wear no official sigil of House Stark. But I suspect they come from the mountain clans near the Vale or maybe the northern hills." Catelyn exchanged a glance with Mance. Could they be some of the freer northern folk who joined Robb's cause? My son mentioned in his letters that the mountain clans pledged men to him. Brynden Tully folded his arms. A strong possibility. Shall we meet them on the field? If they're allies, we must be sure to guide them safely here. So they rode out, a small contingent of Tully men, Wildlings, and Catelyn herself near the front, Mance at her side. The Blackfish led them over rolling hills, the air crisp with the tang of autumn leaves. A few miles beyond Riverlands' outer farmland, they glimpsed the approaching company cresting a rise. 200, perhaps 300 men, some on foot, others mounted on shaggy garrons. They bore axes and spears, though they had little in the way of uniform. At their head was a tall, rangy man wearing a leather cloak with a rough wolf's head pinned at the shoulder. Catelyn guided her horse forward cautiously, her Tully guards fanning out, bows half lowered. Mance and a few wildlings matched their pace. She lifted a hand in greeting. "I am Catelyn Stark," she called. "If you come in peace to join us, let us speak openly. We've no desire for bloodshed." The tall man reined in his garron, a half-smile crossing his weathered face. "I am Wool, son of the Wool from the Northern Mountain clan. We've marched under the young wolf, your son, these past moons. He sent us to scout ahead to see how the Riverlands fare. Said we'd find you here, forging some curious new alliance." Relief flooded Catelyn. "Then Robb is close?" Wool shrugged. "Not far behind us, 2 or 3 days' ride, I'd say, depending on the weather and if the Boltons harass us." His gaze flicked over the Tully men, then rested on Mance Rayder and the handful of wildlings. "So it's true, then. The free folk from beyond the wall and the good folk of the Riverlands stand as one." Mance gave a short nod. "And you are?" "Wool," the man repeated. "We mountain clans call ourselves free folk too, in our own manner, though we're sworn to House Stark by ancient ties. I didn't realize you were the king beyond the wall until now. We've heard your name on the wind these past years." There was a moment of mutual assessment. Wool's men shifted, curiosity lighting their eyes at the sight of Mance's retinue. Then Brynden Tully brought his horse forward. "We welcome you. The Lady Stark's arrangements stand. We've had our fill of war in these parts, but it seems we're not done fighting yet. Are you prepared to lend your blades?" "Aye, that's why we came," Wool said, hefting a large axe. "Our scouts saw signs of Lannister outriders to the southeast. A few skirmishes. Nothing that'd stop us, but they're prowling about. If you've got a warm hearth for the night, we'll accept it gladly." Without further hesitation, Catelyn gestured toward the path. "Come with us. Riverlands halls are open to any who stand with the king in the north." They led the newcomers back, the column trailing behind like a ragged serpent. The Blackfish sent riders ahead to announce the group, so by the time they reached Riverrun, the gates were open, and the small folk gaped at yet another band of unconventional allies. Whispers flew, just as they had when the Wildlings arrived, but this time the presence of a northern banner offered reassurance. Inside the yard, the mountain clansmen dismounted. More than a few cast curious glances at the free folk. Mance's Wildlings regarded them with equal curiosity, some stepping closer to share words or eye each other's weapons. Catelyn overheard one bearded clansman say to a Wildling with a shaved head, "We hear tales that you ride on mammoths. Any truth to that?" And the Wildling grinned, replying with some proud boast. The sense of shared northern heritage, albeit in different forms, allowed them to find a peculiar camaraderie. Not long after, Catelyn guided Wool into a small solar for private talks. The Blackfish stood guard at the door, along with a couple of watchful Tully men. Mance joined them, as did Edmure, who insisted on hearing any news of Robb's movements. Wool recounted more details of the king in the north's approach. "Your sons gathered a decent host, though it's smaller than it once was. Some lords deserted him after the Frye treachery, but others have sworn anew. He's got the Glovers, the remnants of the Karstarks, a few loyal men from White Harbor, and a ragtag company from the Wolfswood. A formidable force all told if we link with you. And there's a rumor that some Ironborn up in the north have retreated to the coast after conflicts with Stannis Baratheon's men near Deepwood Motte. Not sure how that stands now." Catelyn felt a pang of gratitude that Robb was still forging alliances. The mention of the Ironborn made her scowl. Too many enemies harried the north. "If Robb can bring enough swords, we might stand against the Lannisters. Or at least, give Tywin pause." Edmure pressed his lips together. "And if Tywin marches in full strength, we could be outnumbered. He commands a disciplined host that's replenished by Highgarden grain and crown gold. Harrenhal, though half-ruined, makes a strategic center." Mance studied Wool. "Have you or your men seen signs of Bolton movements?" "Little enough," Wool answered. "A few scouts wearing flayed man badges, roving near the outskirts of the Neck. Robb's outriders chased them off. Bolton hasn't marched in open force, likely biding his time in the Dreadfort or at the old Stark seat at Winterfell. The gods know. He won't risk the king in the North's main army yet, I'd wager. The traitor probably hopes we weaken ourselves in battle against the Lions, and then swoop in." A grim silence settled. Catelyn clenched her hands together. The memory of that betrayal. The Red Wedding orchestrated by Freys, Boltons, and Lannisters still tightened her throat. "So we face potential attacks from 3 fronts: Lannister, Frye, and Bolton. Yet if our combined might surpass their calculations, we could repel each in turn." Brynden Tully's eyes glinted. "We should gather all we can: Wildlings, mountain clansmen, Tully levies, any loyal houses. When Robb arrives, we present Tywin with an alliance he cannot easily break. If Tywin falters, Walder Frye may well shrink back, lacking the nerve to face us alone. And if Bolton tries to come south, he'll meet the same resistance." Wool nodded. "That's our best path. When your son draws near, we'll ride to join him." Their immediate strategy thus settled, the conversation shifted to practical matters: quarters, rations, guard rotations. Catelyn quietly oversaw as Wool's men were assigned a section of the courtyard to camp. They would remain as an advance party until Robb arrived. The sense that events were converging gripped her. If only they could hold everything together just a while longer. That evening, a drizzle set in, the clouds gray and ponderous. From the battlements of Riverrun, Catelyn watched men hurry about with canvas and rope to shelter the newly arrived clansmen. The courtyard was turning into a sea of muddy footprints, the smell of damp earth rising around them. In the gloom, torches sputtered, lighting the swirl of activity. Below, she saw Mance Rayder speaking with Tully sergeants, directing them to store newly arrived supplies in one of the barns. A scene that still felt surreal, a king beyond the wall, fully integrated in a southern stronghold. The world had turned on its head. The next morning brought clearing skies and a sudden commotion at the gates. A horn blast echoed against Riverrun's stone, causing folk to pause in their labors. Catelyn hurried to the wall walk, peering down at the approach. In the distance, she glimpsed a column of riders cresting the rise, a banner snapping in the wind, the dire wolf of House Stark, silver gray on a field of ice white. Her heart clenched. At last, she thought. At last he comes. The blackfish barked an order, and the gates were thrown wide. Catelyn descended the spiral steps at a near run, her pulse quickening with every stride. By the time she reached the courtyard, the riders were filing in, mud-spattered and road-weary. At their head, Robb Stark rode with a somber grace. He looked older than his years, eyes shadowed. A fresh scar crossed his temple, and his hair hung in damp curls around his forehead. Yet as soon as he dismounted and spotted his mother, a flicker of relief touched his features. "My lady mother," he said hoarsely, stepping forward. She wrapped him in a fierce embrace, tears stinging her eyes. All around them, Stark men, Tully guards, and Wildlings paused to watch. Catelyn clutched her son as though she could shield him from the cruelty of this war. "My son," she whispered, "you've come." He pulled back slightly, forcing a smile. "I said I would. You were right about forging alliances. We need every sword, every spear. I see you've been busy." She followed his gaze, which swept across the courtyard full of fur-clad wildlings, the tents of the mountain clans, and the Tully men in their trout sigils. "More than I ever imagined," she murmured. "But come inside, Robb. You must be exhausted." He nodded, handing his reins to a stable boy who gawked openly at the king in the north. A crowd of northern soldiers filed in behind, bearing the battered sigils of House Glover, House Mormont, and smaller houses. Among them strode a handful of seasoned knights, their surcoats muddied from the journey. Robb beckoned them to join him. Then, with a final glance around, he set foot inside Riverrun's great hall. As the large oaken doors thudded shut, a hush fell. Servants rushed to light more torches, driving away the morning gloom. Robb took a seat at the high table, an odd sensation, seeing him occupy what had once been the seat of Hoster Tully. Catelyn stood behind him, Mance Rayder on her right, the Blackfish on her left. The northern lords gathered, as did the river lords who could be spared from guard duties, and a selection of wildling representatives. Tormund Giantsbane, recently returned from a scouting trip, joined them with a grin and a quick salute to Robb, though the young king regarded him with open curiosity. "So," Robb said, voice carrying through the hall, "I have come to see if my mother's bold alliance is all I've heard." Mance offered a respectful inclination of his head. "We stand ready to fight at your side, King in the North, if that's your will. We ask only for the right to keep our freedom and settle these lands that have lain ravaged by war." Robb's expression remained guarded. He directed his next words to Catelyn. "Mother, I trust you've explained to them that we cannot simply break the feudal order in these lands? We have river lords who expect fealty." Catelyn took a measured breath. "Yes, but we've worked out a compromise. The free folk will not be feudal tenants. They will farm, trade, and offer mutual defense. In return, we vow to protect them as we would any ally. Several river lords have already sworn to uphold this. It's unconventional, Robb, but it's necessary." A hush spread across the hall. Robb scanned the faces around him, Lord Mallister, who gave a slow nod, Lady Smallwood, who folded her hands with a mild frown, Tully captains, and a handful of wildlings who showed no hint of kneeling. "If it helps us survive this war, so be it," he said finally. "Our true foe is not these folk, but those who burned our homes, killed our people. The Lannisters, the Freys, and..." His jaw tightened. "The Boltons." A grim murmur of assent rolled through the crowd. Mance stepped forward. "What would you have us do, Your Grace?" Robb's gaze flicked over the newcomers. "First, let me see to my own men's rest. Then I'll hear counsel from you, my mother, my uncle, and any who can advise me on the best course. Tywin Lannister sits at Harrenhal, we know. He's the greatest threat for now. Fry might join him or stay put, which is nearly as dangerous. Once we have a plan, we'll march." And with that, the tension in the hall eased into the noisy bustle of an army taking shelter. Servants hurried to prepare bread and stews. Soldiers found corners to shake off the dust of travel. Squires led horses to the stables. Slowly, order took shape. Catelyn accompanied her son to a private chamber, heart fluttering with an anxious maternal need to see him safe and well. Alone in that chamber, lit by the pale light filtering through a narrow window, Robb sagged into a chair. Exhaustion weighted his posture. Catelyn shut the door, then hurried closer. She noticed fresh bruises on his left forearm, the scuffed leather of his gauntlets. "You've been in battle?" she asked, worry sharpening her tone. He nodded wearily. "A few skirmishes, mostly with Bolton men trying to probe our flank. We lost some good men, but the Boltons fell back quickly. They're testing our strength, I suspect, waiting for an opportune moment to strike in force." She pressed her lips together. "Where does your wife, Queen Jane, stand in all this? Did she remain with her family in the West?" A shadow passed across Robb's face. "I left her behind in the safety of the crag with a small guard. She's in no condition to endure the rigors of a campaign." His voice caught. "Mother, there was a child on the way, but she lost it." "Oh, Robb." Her hand flew to her mouth. "I'm so sorry." He closed his eyes, pain flickering over his features. "I worry for her, but it's safer that she remain away from the front. I must focus on the war. I cannot fail again as I did at the twins." Catelyn felt a surge of empathy, recalling her own miscarriages long ago, the agony of each loss. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have not failed. The Freys and Boltons made their treachery. There was little you could do." He let out a ragged breath. "They killed Grey Wind. They shattered the trust of our bannermen. But I'm still here, still the king in the north, for whatever that's worth. If we can defeat Tywin or at least force him to yield ground, the realm may shift once more in our favor." She squeezed his shoulder. "Your father once told me that in war, perseverance counts for more than brilliance. You've persevered through heartbreak no one should face at your age." He opened his eyes, and for a moment, the boy she remembered glimmered behind the king's tired stare. "Thank you, Mother, for forging this alliance. I admit I was skeptical, but I see how it might tip the balance. The stories I heard of the free folk, some called them savages, others said they were just men who lived differently. I sense they will fight fiercely if their new home is threatened." She nodded. "They have proven that already in smaller engagements. Just tread carefully, Robb. They are a proud people, and used to kneeling or following Southern rules. But Mance Rayder is a capable leader. He respects honorable acts." His mouth curved into a faint, sad smile. "Then I'll do my best to show them the same. For now, let me rest a short while. Then we can convene a war council." So Catelyn withdrew, letting him have a moment's peace. Outside the chamber, a swirl of activity continued. She allowed herself a slender thread of hope. Robb was here, leading a force that could stand beside the Wildlings and the Riverlanders. If the realm's many enemies could be kept at bay, perhaps they might carve out some measure of victory, enough to protect those who remained. A few hours later, the War Council assembled in Riverrun's Great Hall. Robb sat at the head of a wide table, the Blackfish at his right hand. On Robb's left sat Mance Rayder, whose presence drew sidelong glances from some northern lords. Tormund Giantsbane lounged nearby with a confident grin. Catelyn and Edmure stood behind Robb, while Wool and a cluster of mountain clansmen hovered near the corner. Arrayed around the table were Malisters, Vances, Smallwoods, and various Tully captains. "We stand united," Robb began, his tone decisive. "Though we come from different worlds, House Stark thanks you for your loyalty and readiness to fight. Now we must decide our next step." Brynden Tully cleared his throat. "There's a matter of Harrenhal and Tywin Lannister. Our scouts confirm he's stockpiling provisions, but not marching. He may wait for reinforcements. Word is that the Reach Lords still send him some supplies, though the Tyrells themselves remain in King's Landing." Lord Mallister, arms folded, frowned. "And the Freys? Any sign they plan to swarm south to trap us?" Edmure shook his head. "No fresh movement from the twins, save for a few patrols. It's possible Walder Frey is hedging his bet. Waiting to see if Tywin can crush us. Then he'll swoop in to pick the bones." Mance spoke up, voice carrying a quiet authority. "We could harass Harrenhal with raiding parties. My people, along with some of your best scouts, might strike at Tywin's supply lines, forcing him to come out and face us where we choose." Robb glanced at Mance. "Risky. Tywin Lannister is no fool. If we overextend ourselves, he may catch our raiders in a trap." Tormund rumbled. "Better that than waiting for him to starve us out. We free folk won't sit idle in a castle while the enemy lords gather." A stir ran through the assembled lords, some nodding, others uneasy. Then Robb raised a hand. "I share your impatience, but let's consider the terrain. Harrenhal sits near the God's Eye. Our best chance is to lure Tywin onto ground we choose, perhaps near the Red Fork or one of the smaller rivers where our archers and cavalry have advantage. If we move too close to Harrenhal, we fight on his terms." Brynden Tully pointed to a map. "There's the old burned village near the upper Red Fork. Sycamore Glen, some call it now. The land there is slightly swampy. Could hamper Tywin's cavalry if we stage an ambush. We'd need a strong enough force to make him take the bait." Mance leaned over the map. "That means putting some of our men in apparent danger, close enough to lure him out. My people excel at feigning weakness in the wilderness. We could set up illusions of a small, disorganized force. Once Tywin commits, the rest of our army strikes from hidden positions." Robb's eyes flicked with renewed energy. "That might work if timed precisely. We have archers from House Glover, spearwives from the Free Folk, Tully cavalry, mountain clans, all with different strengths. We'll need a coordinated plan." He settled back, scanning the faces around the table. "But before we commit to a single bold stroke, we should gather more intelligence. Let's dispatch multiple scouting bands around Harrenhal, ensuring we know Tywin's troop dispositions. If we find an opening, we strike. If not, we adjust." Murmurs of agreement ran through the gathered. Catelyn glanced at Mance, noticing his slight smile. She wondered if he was savoring the novelty of working so closely with Southern lords. The Blackfish signaled for one of his captains to start assembling the scouts. Tormund began rattling off names of wildlings who could serve as guides. "Then it's settled," Robb concluded. "We scout first. Meanwhile, we fortify our position here in Riverrun. If Tywin tries to march west to cut us off, we can intercept him on our own ground. If Frey stirs, we'll deploy watchers near the twins." He paused, surveying the group. "I've no illusions. This is an uphill battle. Tywin outnumbers us, and the Freys can cause havoc at our flank. But we stand a better chance united than we do fractured." He hammered the table lightly for emphasis. The lords and wildlings alike nodded, some wearing grim expressions, others seeming quietly resolved. Catelyn felt the tension thrumming in her own blood. They had a plan, at least a path forward. As the meeting broke up, Robb beckoned Mance to linger a moment. The Blackfish stepped away to address a question from Lord Mallister, while Tormund followed, guffawing about some jest with a mountain clansman. The hall slowly cleared, leaving Robb, Mance, and Catelyn at the table. Robb rested his palms on the map. "I wanted a private word. You lead the Free Folk." "Lead is a strong word," Mance interjected mildly. "We don't have the same chain of command that you do. But yes, they look to me, and in that sense I lead. Robb inclined his head. Yes, then I hope you'll keep them in line. Our operations here require discipline. I can't afford any wild raids on villages that might break the goodwill we've built. Mance's mouth curved slightly. I understand, and I've made it clear to my people that wanton raiding or violence is forbidden under our pact. We're not here to plunder. But you must also understand that many free folk grew up seeing the Southron lords as oppressors. If they're provoked, they might respond. I'll do my best, but discipline among the free folk isn't enforced by fear. It's built on respect. Robb absorbed that, nodding. I can respect that approach so long as they hold to our truce. And when it comes to fighting the Lannisters, I'll rely on your people's adaptability. My lords are used to open field battles. Your folk might adapt better to ambushes, night raids. Mance nodded. We'll do what we must. The Lannisters are no allies to us. They'd kill us just as eagerly as they'd kill you. We fight for survival. Robb straightened. Then we're agreed. He glanced at his mother. Thank you, Mother, for what you've done here. She managed a tight smile. I only hope it's enough. In the following days, the war machine ground into motion. Scouts left in small, discreet units, some composed of Riverlanders guided by Wildlings, others a mix of northern rangers and mountain clansmen who knew how to move silently. They slipped through the war-torn countryside, aiming to skirt Harrenhal's perimeter without drawing Tywin's notice. In the meantime, Riverrun buzzed with preparations for a potential siege or a forced march. Robb made a point of riding out each dawn to inspect the gathered forces. Catelyn often accompanied him, though she stayed slightly behind, letting him exercise command. They would pass rows of men sparring with blunted steel, or lines of archers practicing by the water's edge. Free folk from the Vens, tall and stern, joined in certain drills with Tully pikemen. House Glover's archers taught a group of spearwives to use southern longbows. At first, the atmosphere was tense, but shared purpose melded them slowly. A cause bigger than old prejudices, defending this land from the onslaught of House Lannister. One afternoon, while Robb observed a mixed group of wildlings and Tully cavalry trotting through formation practice, Catelyn turned to find Tormund Giantsbane at her side. He leaned on a fence, his red beard parted in a grin. Never thought I'd see the day, he mused. We had songs that told of kneelers in their shiny armor. Now we're fighting beside them. Catelyn studied him. She had grown used to Tormund's booming laughter and irreverent jibes, but now she sensed a quieter reflection in him. Do you regret it? She asked softly. He shrugged. Not if it helps our children and our families stay alive. The long night's real enough, and these Lannisters are a plague as well. If this alliance is what it takes, so be it. He glanced at her, more serious than usual. But if you betray us, she cut him off gently. I have no intention of betraying anyone, Tormund. He chuckled, half in embarrassment. You've shown yourself good and true so far, Lady Catelyn. Might be my eyes are just always on watch. When you've lived north of the Wall, you learn to trust only what you see proven. She acknowledged that truth with a silent nod. Then they stood together, watching as men and women from vastly different worlds tried to shape themselves into a cohesive fighting force. The scouts returned in pieces, with messages arriving over a span of days. Harrenhal was indeed well garrisoned, though fewer men than expected patrolled outside the fortress. Tywin seemed to be focusing on stockpiling and shoring up the castle's defenses. One group of scouts reported seeing baggage trains heading west, possibly reinforcing small Lannister outposts, but the details were scant. At a late evening war council, Robb pored over the gathered intelligence. He's either baiting us or preparing for a siege, he concluded. If we approach Harrenhal directly, he can entrench behind those blackened walls. We'd lose half our men storming it, if not more. We need to draw him out. Mance, you suggested a feint near Sycamore Glen. I'd like you to organize that. Assemble a mix of wildlings and Riverlanders who can act convincingly like a small, vulnerable force. Approach Harrenhal's perimeter as if you plan to raid. Mance exchanged a glance with Tormund, who bared his teeth in a grin. Mance said. We'll draw them like flies to rotten meat. We'll need a secure fallback position, though. That swampy terrain can help us vanish if we're outnumbered. Brynden Tully tapped the map. There's a series of old ridges and copses to the west. We can station archers and cavalry there. Once Tywin commits, we sweep in. If we can slaughter enough of his men, he might be forced to retreat. Robb's jaw tightened. We must remain vigilant for the phrase. I'll position a strong rearguard near the Green Fork to guard against any sudden move from the twins. He glanced at Catelyn. Mother, will you remain here in Riverrun or ride with the main force? She hesitated. In truth, her heart yearned to stay out of yet another battlefield. But she knew her presence might help maintain unity. The Wildlings looked to her for reassurance that House Stark stood by them. The Riverlords trusted her counsel. I will ride with you, she said softly. If that is your command, my king. Robb's expression softened. It is not my command, but your choice. I'd welcome your guidance. However, if you'd rather remain behind. No, she interrupted. I've hidden behind these walls too long. I'll see this fight through. A nod passed between them, so the decision was made. The next days saw a flurry of activity as the feint was organized. Mance selected Tormund and Rika, the spearwife with the braided hair, to lead a large portion of the Wildling raiders. They would join a detachment of Tully skirmishers. In total, about 400 men and women. They would appear to any Lannister outriders as a scattered band of marauders. Meanwhile, the main host, composed of the northern forces, the mountain clansmen, and the bulk of the Tully levies, would march discreetly, positioning themselves to the west of Harrenhal. Robb himself would lead that larger army, accompanied by the Blackfish and the main cavalry. Catelyn, for her part, intended to ride near the van, observing and advising. When the day finally came to march, dawn broke over a restless camp. Horses whinnied, men cursed, wagons creaked. Mance and Tormund set off early with their band, forging ahead. Robb's host moved out an hour later. Catelyn rode beside him, pulling her cloak tight against the chill. The sky was overcast, promising rain. They traveled for 2 days along muddy roads, passing through farmland that had been sacked and resacked by one force or another. The small folk they encountered seemed cautious but not hostile, especially upon recognizing the Stark banners. Occasionally, free folk broke away to hunt game or gather forage, returning with rabbits and small deer. The Riverlords were initially wary of letting wildlings roam, but the arrangement proved beneficial to feed the host. On the evening of the second day, they camped near a burned holdfast. Smoke from the cookfires curled into the cool air. Robb and his main captains gathered in a small tent to receive updates from Tormund's infiltration. A scout arrived, panting from a hard ride, to relay that Tormund's band had reached Sycamore Glen, found it suitably marshy, and was setting up hidden pickets. No sign of a major Lannister force yet. Robb dismissed the scout with thanks, but the tension in the tent was palpable. Catelyn tried to rest that night, but sleep eluded her. She felt the weight of too many possibilities. She lay awake in her tent, listening to the wind stir the trees. Somewhere near, men coughed, muttered. Across the camp, she heard occasional laughter or an argument quickly hushed. Outside, the guard patrolled, watchful for any sign of an enemy approach. The battle, when it came, arrived swifter than expected. At mid-morning on the third day, word reached Robb. Tormund's band had engaged a Lannister patrol near the outskirts of Harrenhal. Several outriders had fled back to the fortress. The plan was in motion. Now it was a matter of whether Tywin would rise to the bait. Robb pressed the march, guiding his main army southwest along a series of low hills. The land here was damp, dotted with narrow streams that fed the Red Fork. According to Tormund's earlier report, the shallow glen where they waited was a half-day's ride away. By afternoon, banners snapped in a stiff breeze as the main host approached. Scouts raced in to confirm. A large Lannister force was marching out from Harrenhal, cavalry in the van, foot soldiers close behind. Thousands, perhaps. They seemed intent on crushing what they believed to be a small raiding party of wildlings and Tully rebels. Rob's eyes glinted. "He's taken the bait," he said quietly. Then, more loudly, he commanded, "Form ranks. We must be in position before nightfall." Catelyn rode among the ranks, scanning faces. She saw northern pikemen in battered armor, Riverlanders with trout badges, Wildlings clutching spears, mountain clansmen with axes. So many people united under the direwolf banners. The memory of the red wedding loomed, but she forced it aside. This time they had chosen the battleground. Night fell before they reached the glen. Scouts confirmed that Tormund had pulled back slightly, letting the Lannisters think they were in full retreat. The enemy had camped some miles away, likely intending to strike at dawn. Robb halted his own army on a broad rise overlooking the glen, ordering a silent encampment. No large fires, no reckless noise. They would rest a few hours and be ready to meet Tywin's forces at first light. In the quiet darkness, Catelyn walked among the men, offering words of encouragement. She found groups of wildlings singing low, throaty tunes that spoke of ice and wind. Northern soldiers huddled nearby, some listening intently despite the cultural gulf. A few men sharpened swords by candlelight. The tension was tangible, a stillness before a storm. She returned to the command tent, where Robb, Mance, and the Blackfish were finalizing the battle plan. They spoke in hushed tones over a lantern-lit map, pointing to ridges and boggy areas that might prove advantageous. When they noticed her, they looked up. Robb's face was drawn. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "we settle this or at least strike a blow. If we rout Tywin here or even bloody him, the Lannisters may be forced to retreat to Harrenhal and cede the field." Mance's eyes were hooded. "And if we fail, Tywin could scatter our forces. Harrenhal's walls will loom behind him, giving him a fallback. But I believe we have the advantage of surprise." Brynden Tully nodded sharply. "Yes, so long as Tormund and Rika hold their nerve. They must withstand the first onslaught, drawing Tywin in further. Then the rest of us strike." A silence fell. Catelyn reached for Robb's hand. He squeezed it, then let go. "We'd best sleep if we can," he said. "Dawn will come too soon." Catelyn managed only a few hours of restless slumber in her small tent. She awoke before dawn, hearing the low stir of the camp. Armor clinked, horses snorted. She rose, dressed in a plain but sturdy travel gown, pulling on a thick cloak embroidered with the Stark sigil. Exiting her tent, she found a chill wind slicing across the camp. Men were breaking their fast on hard bread and cold meat. Fires were few to avoid drawing attention in the darkness. She located Robb, who was already mounted, conferring with the Blackfish. The young king wore partial plate, the direwolf sigil shining on his breastplate, though scuffed from previous battles. His sword was at his hip, a stern set to his jaw. Catelyn felt that familiar ache of both pride and fear. Despite his youth, he had the bearing of a commander who had faced betrayal, defeat, and heartbreak, and yet continued on. "All is in place," he told her quietly. "If the Lannisters advance, we'll swoop down from the ridge. The war horns will sound the charge." She nodded, swallowing her anxiety. "May the gods watch over us, Robb." The sun's first faint glow lit the eastern sky. Brynden Tully led the cavalry to form on the slope, while Mance and a contingent of wildlings fanned out through a stretch of scrub and undergrowth, poised for a flanking maneuver. Northern spearmen held the center, commanded by one of Robb's most trusted bannermen, Lord Glover. Catelyn, positioned near the Blackfish, tried to keep her face composed as the minutes crawled by. Then, from far below in the glen, came the distant clash of steel and a roar of voices. Tormund had engaged the Lannisters. The faint notes of a horn carried up on the morning wind, and Robb's eyes flashed. He drew his sword. "Now!" the Blackfish bellowed. "Forward!" The war horns of the north blared, echoing off the hills. With a thunder of hooves, the cavalry burst forward, surging down the slope toward the glen. Northern foot soldiers and wildlings charged alongside, a flood of armed fury. Catelyn urged her horse to follow at a safer remove, her heart hammering. She caught glimpses of the battlefield below, Lannister banners of red and gold clashed with the ragged shapes of Tormund's feigning force. Now the main body of Tywin's army reeled as the ambush thundered in on their flank. At once, chaos erupted. The ground was treacherous, slick from marshy patches. Lannister knights tried to form a defensive line, but Brynden Tully's cavalry crashed into them with brutal momentum. Men were thrown from their saddles, horses shrieking. Wildling archers emerged from the undergrowth, loosing arrows into the confusion. Robb, at the head of his northern foot, slammed into a pocket of Lannister infantry, driving them back with the ferocity that once earned him the name Young Wolf. Catelyn reined up on a slight rise to watch, heart in her throat. The clangor of steel, the screams of men, filled the air. She could see Tormund's red beard as he led a knot of wildlings deeper into the fray, axes whirling. The Blackfish, on his horse, directed Tully men to exploit any gaps. Mance Rayder was less distinguishable, blending among his people, fighting with efficient skill. A trumpet blast sounded from the Lannister side. Through the melee, Catelyn glimpsed disciplined ranks of red-cloaked soldiers pushing forward to relieve their battered front line. Tywin himself was nowhere in sight. He might be coordinating from the rear. The Lannisters tried to regroup, but the marshy ground hindered their cavalry, and the sudden assault from multiple angles sapped their cohesion. Everywhere, men fell. The mud churned with blood and shattered weapons. Robb's standard-bearer advanced, the dire wolf flapping in the wind. The king in the north broke through a cluster of Lannister pikemen, slicing past their spears with a swift sword stroke. For an instant, the sun glinted on his blade, on his breastplate. Catelyn's breath caught. He looked so much like Ned in that moment. The Lannisters began to waver. Some fell back, trying to regroup on higher ground. Others tried to fight their way free, only to be cut down by wildlings attacking from flanks. Tormund's bellowing war cries spurred the free folk onward, while the Blackfish's signal horns rallied Tully levies to press the advantage. But Tywin Lannister had not gained his reputation by cowardice. A reserve force of heavy horse now thundered in from the west, slamming into the flank of the northern spearmen. Men screamed, toppled under the charge. Catelyn saw Robb's line buckle, the direwolf banner swaying. Panic shot through her. She urged her horse forward, but the Blackfish galloped past, shouting, "Stay back, Cat!" as he led Tully knights to reinforce Robb's position. A savage struggle ensued. The ground was thick with mud and bodies, horses flailing as they stumbled. She watched in horror as a Tully knight was thrown, crushed under hooves. Another rallying horn sounded, Mance's signal. From behind a copse of trees, a fresh wave of wildlings charged, howling, smashing into the Lannister reserve. The Lannister horse reeled, losing momentum. Northern spearmen rallied at Robb's command, thrusting pikes into the chests of disoriented knights. Then, with a great shout, Tormund, Rika, and other wildlings joined from the side, hacking at the red-cloaked cavalry. It was too much. The Lannister line collapsed, men breaking rank to flee. Some tried to stand, only to be surrounded by spearwives or pinned by Tully archers. Slowly, inexorably, the wave of allied forces pushed the lions back, deeper into the muddy glen. A scattering of Lannisters attempted a last-ditch stand, but Robb himself led a charge that shattered them. Their banner toppled, and the survivors turned tail, retreating in disarray. Breathless, Catelyn guided her horse into the churned battlefield, picking her way around fallen men. The moans of the wounded rose on every side. Smoke from scattered fires stung her nose. She found Robb dismounting near the remains of the Lannister standard, his face streaked with sweat and blood, though he seemed largely unhurt. Men cheered him as he passed, calling out, "The king in the north!" or "Stark!" He waved them silent, kneeling briefly beside a wounded Tully soldier, murmuring words of comfort. Tormund limped over, an axe still in his hand. His red beard was clotted with blood. "A fine scrap. They broke faster than I expected." Despite his grin, his eyes flickered with sorrow at the sight of the carnage. "We lost good folk, but we bloodied them well." Robb nodded, rising. "Indeed, but Tywin might regroup if he's still out there. Mance, have you seen him? Mance Rayder emerged from the haze, breathing hard. A shallow cut bled from his arm. No sign of Tywin. I suspect he stayed behind or even retreated when things turned ill. Perhaps he never intended to fight us himself. But we caught a few Lannister officers in the rout. They might know more. Nearby, Brynden Tully reined in his horse, surveying the field. "We've taken the Glen," he announced. "They're in full retreat to the southeast, likely making for Harrenhal. Should we pursue?" Robb frowned, scanning the exhausted ranks. Many of his men were wounded, his cavalry battered, and the mud was ankle-deep in places. A cautious pursuit, he decided. Send outriders to harass them and gather information. But our main host is in no shape for a forced march just yet. We hold the field. A ragged chorus of cheers went up among the allied soldiers. Tormund hooped, raising his axe overhead. Free folk joined in, as did Tully men, and even some of the mountain clans, chanting Robb's name. Catelyn closed her eyes, relief mingling with sorrow for the many who had fallen. They had won this time. The Lannisters had been repelled, their ranks bloodied, but Tywin remained at large. Moments later, Robb was at her side. "Mother, are you unhurt?" She nodded, voice tight. "I'm well. You fought bravely, Robb." She cast her gaze across the field, where men scoured for survivors, saw the Blackfish organizing stretcher-bearers, Mance and Tormund conferring about the next steps. "We owe this victory to the unity we forged. Wildlings, Riverlanders, Northerners, everyone." He followed her gaze. "It seems the realm can stand together when given cause enough. The question is, will it hold once Tywin regroups?" She brushed a hand over his hair, damp with sweat. "One victory at a time, my son." But in her heart, she knew the war was far from over. The phrase still lurked, Bolton still posed a threat, and Tywin Lannister never gave up easily. Yet for this day, they had struck a blow that proved the alliance was no fleeting fancy. It had teeth, and it could tear at the lion's throat. The hours after the battle were spent tending the wounded, regrouping, setting up a hasty encampment. Rain threatened, a soft drizzle that made the ground even more treacherous. Catelyn moved among the makeshift infirmaries, speaking words of comfort where she could. The smell of blood and dirt filled her senses. Medics, both Southern and Wildling, worked side by side. She found a fallen Tully knight she recognized, Ser Arwood Metal, barely clinging to life with a grievous gut wound. She knelt at his side, took his hand. He tried to speak, but only coughed up blood. She pressed his fingers gently, whispering prayers until he passed. The sorrow stung her eyes, but she had no tears left for these countless deaths. She would carry them all in her heart, each soul that gave its life to protect the realm. Further along, she found Tormund holding a battered wildling youth in his arms. The boy, no more than 15, had taken a sword blow across the chest. Tormund's brash bravado was gone, replaced by quiet grief as he stroked the boy's hair, muttering, "Hold fast, lad. Just hold on." But the boy's face was pale. Catelyn hovered, helpless, until a healer came, shaking her head grimly. Tormund shut his eyes, shoulders trembling. With quiet respect, Catelyn laid a hand on his broad back for a moment before moving on. Everywhere, the living did what they could for the dying, whether they wore fur or steel. This was the true face of war. So many undone families. Yet if there was any consolation, it was that the men from different worlds were tending each other's wounds now, forging a solidarity of shared suffering. Catelyn prayed it would endure. As dusk gathered, Robb summoned the leaders for a brief council of next steps. Though the victory was theirs, it was incomplete. Tywin's main body had retreated toward Harrenhal. They had captured a few important prisoners, including a lesser Lannister cousin who might yield valuable intelligence. Robb proposed sending further scouts to watch the roads, to see if Tywin might attempt a counterstroke. Some lords urged an immediate assault on Harrenhal before the Lannisters could recover. But the Blackfish, Tormund, and Mance all cautioned that their own numbers were too bruised, their men too weary. The fortress was formidable, with high walls and a massive gatehouse. Storming it would cost hundreds of lives. Better to besiege from a position of strength or force Tywin out again. Thus, they agreed. Rest, recover, gather more allies if possible, and maintain constant vigilance around Harrenhal's perimeter. The war would grind on, but for now they held the momentum. House Stark and its new allies had proven that the Lannisters could be outmaneuvered. That night, the exhausted men and women of the allied host bedded down in the muddy glen. Broken wagons were salvaged for kindling, meager fires lit against the damp. Soldiers huddled under makeshift tarps, sharing what little bread and ale remained. The night air was filled with the groans of wounded and the quiet hush of those tending them. Catelyn wandered until she found a moment alone, stepping out to a small rise above the encampment. The sky was overcast, no moon visible. Yet in the darkness, she felt the presence of so many grieving souls. She lifted her gaze, breathing a silent prayer to the old gods and the new, for guidance, for strength. Behind her, footsteps crunched. She turned to see Mance Rayder approach. He carried a small torch, its flames sputtering in the chill breeze. He paused a few paces away, his dark eyes reflecting the torchlight. "Lady Stark," he said softly, "I saw you tending the wounded. You have a generous heart." She shook her head. "I did little enough. So many died today." He nodded gravely. "That's war. But we achieved something, too. We faced the lion and lived. Perhaps we can do more yet." A gust of wind blew, snuffing the torch's flame to a faint glow. In the sudden gloom, Mance's face was but a silhouette. Catelyn swallowed. "What do you think Tywin will do now?" "Regroup behind his walls, likely. Wait for reinforcements. Maybe call on Fry. The question is whether old Walder dares commit men to a battered cause." She stared into the darkness. "If we can force peace, or at least secure the Riverlands, it may give us the chance to brace for the real threat beyond the wall." He made a low sound of assent. "I've not forgotten that. None of my people have. The Whites, the White Walkers. They're still there, biding their time. But for now, your southern war must be fought. We'll stand with you until it's done, or until we can push no more." She regarded him with a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I never thought I would call someone from beyond the wall an ally, a friend, but I suppose the realm changes us." A half-smile curved his lips, just visible in the dim. "It does." He let the silence linger, the only sound the distant murmur of the camp. "Get some rest, Lady Stark." She nodded, watching as he turned and made his way back down the slope, his torch a faint orange ember in the night. Alone again, she drew her cloak tighter. This alliance had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. Wildlings, Northerners, Riverlanders, all facing the cunning might of Tywin Lannister. And beyond that, the Boltons, the Freys, and the creeping doom from the far north. Yet they had taken a step forward today, and that was enough to keep hope alive. She bowed her head, letting a single tear fall for the lives lost. War was cruel, but if there was any path to saving the realm from the nightmares looming over it, they had to press on together. If the hearts of enemies and strangers could be won over, perhaps the next dawn might see a stronger realm, one capable of resisting both the lion's claws and the icy claws of the dead. On that battlefield slope, Catelyn Stark said her final prayers for the departed, then turned back toward the glow of the campfires. Tomorrow and all the days after, they would need her resolve. The war was not won, but for now they stood united. And in that unity, fragile though it might be, lay the seed of a future that could outlast the storms gathering on every horizon.